Everybody's in.
What we got? Anna Claire, Ian Thatcher, hello. Karen, Kevin, lots of new people. Rethink Urban. Who is Rethink Urban? Hi, Susan. Susan Watt. Betsy George. Great.
Okay, we seem to be stabilized here with our attendees. So welcome everybody. My name is Luke Cranhoff and I'm the chair of the Oak Bay Gordon Head Riding Association, and I'm speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Lekwungen speaking people and the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. And so what tonight is the last in terms of the sort of winter spring series of our Voices of Victoria that we're having here today. And Voices of Victoria is a series that we with the local provincial Greens have developed, where we profile area residents doing interesting and extraordinary things. And the area person doing both interesting and extraordinary things tonight is Jasmindra Jawanda. And Jasmindra has a bachelor's degree in community and regional planning and a master's degree in community and regional planning and a bachelor's in education from UBC, as well as a bachelor's in economics and Japanese from UVic. Jasmindra's master's thesis was conducted in the Amazon region of Ecuador in the areas of community development, sustainable development, environmental planning, cultural preservation, and indigenous capacity building. Jasmindra is passionate about nature, books, critical thinking, social justice, community building, music, poetry, spoken word, meditating, spirituality, traveling, and having as many diverse life experiences as possible. So very excited to have Jasmindra join us tonight in our series. And so how it's going to work is I'll hand it over to Jasmindra, and then she'll do her presentation, and then Rita will be in charge of doing the Q's and A's. And so you'll see the Q&A tab down at the bottom, and you can submit your questions through there. We've set it up so that if you submit your questions, only the panelists will see them. And then Rita will take from those questions, and she might summarize a couple of them, put them together, whatever, or however it works to pose them to Jasmindra at the end. So at this point, I am going to turn off mine and Rita's video, and we'll turn it over to Jasmindra. And okay, welcome, Jasmindra.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure being here. And I do want to thank Jim Hesser and Barbara Hansen for inviting me on board, as well as the Green Party staff, Luke, Simone, Troy, and Rita. So thank you so much. And the presentation tonight is called Weaving Our Community Through Creative Placemaking. And as an urban community cultural planner, I'm so excited to be presenting this very important topic today around placemaking. Before I begin, I'd like to talk about a land appreciation. So I have a friend, and her name is Anna, and she's an Indigenous woman. And Anna has recently taught me that instead of land acknowledgement, we should be saying land appreciation. And I want to honor her words because she was also taught by her Indigenous elders. We often say land acknowledgement, but I think we should switch it around and say land appreciation, because when we acknowledge something, are we appreciating it? So I'd like to start off with the land appreciation. I honor, respect, and deeply appreciate the unceded lands that I live, work, create, and breathe on, belonging to the Songhees and Esquimalt nations and the Wisanic peoples, known today as Sartlip, Pakwachin, Sayout, Saikum, and Malahat nations. Sat Sri Akal. Hello. I was born here in the unceded lands of the Wisanic peoples to immigrant parents from India. And as an urban planner of color, I thank you all for joining me on this journey of placemaking from the global south to the local north. I really hope you walk away stimulated and ignited to create a diverse, inclusive, and vibrant fabric of placemaking in the public spaces in your community. So together, let's reimagine and reshape our public spaces. So for tonight's presentation's outline, I'm going to have a brief introduction followed by what is community-based planning and participatory planning, then venturing into placemaking, specifically then creative placemaking, and I'll take some examples from the global South landscape. Then I would like to delve into racism and decolonizing public spaces, and also touch upon a new planning paradigm called equity-based placemaking. Then I'll take some local examples of placemaking, and then finally a few concluding remarks, and then I'm going to open it up to all of you wonderful people for some questions. It will be about 40 minutes, and so I thank you for hearing out my voice, and I thank you for holding space for me tonight and this presentation. My experiences of living, working, and traveling in places such as Japan, India, South Africa, Uruguay, and Cuba, as well as other countries, have deeply impacted and influenced my view of looking at placemaking and planning through a kaleidoscope of colorful cultural lenses. I am really inspired to share some of my planning insights and expertise into how we can reimagine and reshape public spaces of Greater Victoria, in particular, by weaving community through a social equity perspective through two placemaking processes: one, creative placemaking, and two, equity-based placemaking. Creative placemaking and equity-based placemaking are both critical and vital in order to create decolonizing, inclusive, safe, vibrant, and welcoming public spaces within our communities and cities. As an urban planner, I'm always perplexed and actually saddened how our public spaces in Canada are missing the most important element: the public. Public spaces are built for public use, but if you look around in your own community, you will often see only a few folks milling about in these vast spaces. So I ask, where are the people? In other parts of the world, public spaces are full of people and sometimes overcrowded and even spilling out onto the streetscape. But in these countries, there is a social investment in the land, which brings people out to move, mingle, and meander into these spaces. In my own words, I say land is a luxury, yet we treat it as a deficit here in the North and the West. Land is a luxury, yet we treat it as a deficit. If you look around, we have vast spaces of land, but they're underutilized. And they're ineffective in some ways because the people aren't there. So it's a luxury here. And that's how we treat it, as a deficit. So what is community-based planning? A popular urban planning buzzword in the planning landscape is community-based planning. Community-based planning is when people who are concerned about neighborhood issues take active leadership by clearly identifying their community needs and advocating passionately for local community concerns. When neighborhoods are given power over planning and when residents raise local solutions to the local problems, this leads to inclusive, citizen-led, and participatory planning. It is a new light switch turning on. It's power to the people versus planning over people. So what is effective community-based planning? Effective community-based planning is having a strong level of political will and the financial and technical support from government.
Jasmindra, I'm just going to interrupt. Did you mean to share your screen?
Yes.
With your slides? Because you haven't done that. I'm not seeing it.
Oh, okay. Should we step back? Okay,
You want to
so
get caught up to where you are? Sorry for interrupting.
that's okay. I can just briefly go over it again. So share. Do you have it now, Rita?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Well, everyone, I didn't realize that as I was talking, there was no slides. So I'm just quickly going to reiterate what I said, and I'm just going to go over it because I think it's actually beneficial to see the words as well. So thank you. The land appreciation I already talked about, so I won't go over that slide. So let's reimagine and reshape our public spaces. And the intro outline I've already gone over, so I'm going to skip to the next slide. And I think I'll bring it back to community-based planning so that everyone can see the words. And please, Rita, let me know if you can hear me okay. So again, community-based planning is a popular urban planning buzzword. And it's really when people who are concerned about the neighborhood issues take the active leadership by clearly identifying their community needs and advocating passionately for local community concerns. It's when neighborhoods are given power over planning and when residents raise the local solution to the local problems, which leads to inclusive, citizen-led, and participatory planning. Basically, it's a new light switch turning on, power to the people versus planning over people. An effective community-based planning, strong level of political will with financial and technical support. It's a high level of community ownership and citizen participation. You want a long view of sustainable community development, and you want to have adequate time to be allocated to conduct community engagement and establish a trusting dialogue among stakeholders. We also need to foster and build consensus on community issues, goals, and recommendations. According to the Planners Network, a central tenet of community-based planning is building and strengthening communities and developing local leadership. The sense of empowerment and community identity generated through active involvement and self-determination will help to sustain community development efforts and strengthen civil society in general. Which brings us now to participatory planning. Participatory planning is an urban planning paradigm where a community undertakes a process to reach a given socio-cultural, environmental, economic goal by consciously diagnosing its problems and charting a course of action to find the solutions. The key balance to be achieved is to simultaneously allow individual citizens to have their say on specific problems while creating a collective picture of neighborhood priorities that can inform a vision and goals. It places key emphasis on involving the entire community in the community planning process. Entire refers to a good representation of the diversity within a community, not just certain segments of the demographics. So for myself as an urban planner and as a community member, oftentimes when I go to community workshops, there is one main demographic group that is represented, happens to be older, and they happen to be white. And so I'm always looking for diversity in its different forms. So this is why it's so important that we emphasize that diversity is key to participatory planning. As participatory planning approach is essentially a community engagement process, some call it plan local. For example, according to Civic Plan, instead of a sparsely attended statutory public meeting, think instead of the buzz in a room at the beginning of a neighborhood planning process, where the community is invited to directly point out issues, sometimes literally on a map, and they're looking at their streets or elsewhere in their neighborhoods. And then they propose ideas or solutions to make their spaces better. This is what a Plan Local community lab looks like. And it helps using grassroots engagement to establish a broader vision for a neighborhood. Effective participatory planning needs to connect citizens, city staff, and political leaders in a shared process that is understood by all three groups. This way, political leaders can channel public knowledge into actionable projects for city staff, as the community then becomes a vital tool for building vibrant local communities. Participatory planning is a way of doing planning that puts residents at the center of decision-making in their community, where the community feels ownership over the process and the results, and where they see their hard work reflected in a community vision that gets built because of their involvement. Simply put, it is a process of for the people, by the people. Which now we come to placemaking. Placemaking is a hands-on approach for planning and improving a neighborhood, city, or region by inspiring people to collectively reimagine and reshape public spaces as a heartbeat of every community. At the center of placemaking is community-based and participatory planning, where the process capitalizes on a local community's assets, inspiration, and potential. And it results in the creation of vibrant and inclusive public spaces that contribute to people's health, happiness, and well-being. Placemaking also shows people just how powerful their collective vision can be. It helps them to reimagine and reshape everyday spaces and to see through new lenses the potential of streets, parks, downtowns, waterfronts, plazas, neighborhoods, markets, campuses, and public buildings. One of the visionary pioneers of placemaking is Jane Jacobs, an American-Canadian journalist and urbanist who introduced groundbreaking ideas about designing cities for people, not just cars, buildings, and shopping centers. Her work focused on the social and cultural importance of lively neighborhoods and inviting community input into designing public spaces. She encouraged everyday citizens to take ownership of streets through the now famous idea of eyes on the street. For myself, I see placemaking not only as a process, but moreover a philosophy and lifestyle, as it should be centered around deep observing, listening, and asking questions of the people around us who live, work, and play in a particular space or neighborhood in order to understand the unique needs and aspirations for that space and for their community as a whole. Placemaking absolutely should promote justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, where everyone feels a sense of place and belonging, which can lead to the betterment of physical, social, emotional, ecological, and spiritual health for individuals, communities, and cities. According to Projects for Public Space, a great public space cannot be measured by its physical attributes alone. It must also serve people as a vital community resource in which function always trumps form. When people of all ages, abilities, and socioeconomic backgrounds can not only access and enjoy a place, but also play a key role in its identity, creation, and maintenance, that is when we see genuine placemaking in action. So what is effective placemaking? Effective placemaking is community-driven, it's visionary, it's function before form, it's adaptable, it's inclusive, it focuses on creating destinations, it's context-specific, it's dynamic, it's transdisciplinary, it's transformative, flexible, collaborative, and sociable. Now, what is non-effective placemaking? Non-effective placemaking is top-down, that's often government approaches, it's reactionary, design-driven, a blanket solution or a quick fix, it's exclusionary, it's car-centric, it's a one-size-fits-all, it's static, it's discipline-driven, it's one-dimensional, It depends on regulatory controls. It's a cost benefit analysis that focuses on the tangible, not the intangible. And it's usually project focused, not neighborhood or community focused. That's non-effective placemaking. Placemaking really belongs to everyone, as it is the people who truly make a place. And a good test for an effective public space is whether or not it has people in the space. It's as simple as that. So the placemaking test that I do is, if there's no people in a space, it equals an effective public space. If there's many people in that public space, it's an effective public space. So I encourage all of you, when you walk around in your neighborhoods, your communities, the city, look around in the public spaces and do this placemaking test. Really simple. If you see people, something's being done right. There's a resonance. If you don't see a lot of people in those public spaces, you might ask, why? Which brings us to creative placemaking. Coined by Anne Markison and Anne Gadwa Nicodermus for the National Endowment for the Arts in 2010, creative placemaking refers to the process in which partners from public, private, nonprofit, and community sectors strategically shape the physical and social character of a neighborhood, town, city, or region around arts and cultural activities. Creative placemaking equals when arts meets culture, meets diversity. For arts and culture, it can involve a painter, musician, poet, sculpture, or any other expression of arts and culture. The placemaking project could be a mural, a street carnival, busker musicians, live theater, or public art sculpture. Diversity refers to including neighborhood residents, businesses, nonprofits, faith organizations, academic institutions, and government agencies. And together, reimagining and reshaping a space by combining arts, culture, and diversity, it can convert an ineffective, underutilized space and make it something welcoming, inclusive, safe, beautiful, and vibrant. Arts, culture, and design can definitely help to strengthen communities by, one, bringing a new attention to or elevate key community voices of residents, local her story, or cultural infrastructure. Two, by injecting new or additional energy, resources, activity, people, or vitality into a place, community issue, or local economy. Three, envisioning new possibilities for a community or a place, a new future, a new way of overcoming a challenge or approaching problem solving. And finally, connecting communities, people, places, and economic opportunity via physical and social spaces or new relationships. Creative placemaking requires partnership across sectors, deeply engages the community, involves artists, designers, and cultural bearers, and helps to advance local economic, physical, and/or social change, ultimately laying the groundwork for systems change. It can be deployed as a strategy to address a wide range of community issues or challenges, from public health to racism and discrimination, safety, economic development, housing, to transportation. In the context of transportation projects, Transportation for America defines creative placemaking as follows. Creative placemaking harnesses the power of arts and culture to allow for more genuine public engagement, particularly in low-income neighborhoods, communities of color, and among immigrant populations in the development of transportation projects. Forget the traditional staid public meeting format and instead imagine artists engaging community members using multiple languages to generate meaningful dialogues, capturing their creativity and local knowledge to better inform the ultimate design of the project. Done right, creative placemaking can lead to both a better process and a better product. The end results are streets, sidewalks, and public spaces that welcome us, inspire us, and move us in every sense of that word. A successful creative placemaking project is one that attracts people. It is human nature for people to want to be near other people, whether they want to mix with those people or meander solo on their own. It is by meeting other people where we can unpack, unlearn, and relearn, and where we can decolonize our minds by listening and learning about other ways of being, doing, and knowing. Some examples of creative placemaking are when an abandoned building becomes artist studios and a gallery space, when an abandoned parking lot becomes an outdoor food hub with food trucks, when an overgrown park becomes a place for community gardens or live theater venues. Which now takes me to the global scene of placemaking. I have two photos there taken from the internet. The first one with the colorful banners is in Korea. And when you look into that picture, you can feel the creative placemaking. You see the beautiful banners, all different colors. And if you look on the sides, you notice that it's in a park. So it's bringing in naturescape, it's bringing in the artscape, and then you see people walking and it's bringing in the peoplescape, which is a great example of creative placemaking. And the other one that I chose is a funky building. And this one is in Europe, and I believe it's in Italy. And this is what we can do with our built form. If you look at all of the cool bikes on the building, and then of course someone's looking out, this is so creative. And I think to myself, when someone walks by that building, if it's a child and they look up and they see these bikes, it might inspire them to start riding a bike. Or if it's a senior walking by and they see these bikes, it might take them down that memory scape of when they were riding their bikes. Or if it's a bike enthusiast who might stop and look at the building and kind of source out all the different types of the bikes. So I thought it was a really cool photo to show of how a built form, a building, can also incorporate creative placemaking. Now, nature and culture is fascinating. So when I was living and working in Japan, one of my favorite memories is the Cherry Blossom Festival. So in Kobe, and also Kyoto, which is not too far from Kobe, when I ventured out, and you'll see a picture of me with a Canadian friend one evening, because it's in the evenings that the people in Japan come out to celebrate and honor the cherry blossoms. So you can see the photo with all the people, that was from the internet. It's so wonderful. They're sitting on these platforms, they're drinking, they're eating, they're chatting, and it's at night. And so you'll see the lights coming through the cherry blossoms. And it's a very magical experience. And some of you may have experienced what I experienced in Japan during the Cherry Blossom Festival. And I often think here in Victoria, can we not transplant this great global sample right here on our front yards, backyards, and parks when we have our cherry blossoms blooming? The next one is placemaking around diversity and inclusion. I happened to lived and worked in Uruguay, and I stayed in a small town called Libertad, which is just a few hours away from Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay. And one of my favorite pastimes was every Sunday, I would go with my Uruguayan family to this square that you're seeing right now. It's called Plaza 33 Orientals, which means Plaza 33 in English. So every Sunday I would go with my host family. We had the grandparents and we had the younger generation, and together we would go. And this square that you're seeing was packed, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. So every Sunday it was about grandparents meeting the musicians, meeting the poets. In the center of the square are art sculptures and a fountain. And the square is large. It's a few city blocks. And you'll notice parking all along, which makes it mobile and accessible for older people. And they have ramps going in along the curbs. So when I was with my family, we'd have to drive around a few times to find a parking spot. So the elderly grandparents to get could get out. But this is really good and effective placemaking and planning right here in front of us. And so once again, diversity and inclusion, multi-generational, it's thriving, especially on Sundays. And then I think to myself, in Victoria, I look at City Hall and Centennial Square, and I don't see a lot of people. It's a square, but again, there's no hub, there's no buzz, there's no activity. So again, this is a great example from Libertad, Uruguay, from the global south that we can transplant here in the local north. And placemaking around arts and culture. So I was on a trip to Havana, Cuba recently with two of my friends, Claudia and Kevin. And we ventured into this really cool art alley called Callejón de Hamel. And Callejón means alley. And it was a long alley. And if you can see closely, there's some funky furniture art. If you look above, they had installations all around us. So as you walk down this alley in Havana, alongside the furniture, alongside the street art, they actually have galleries with local artists creating their wares, their products that they can actually sell to the people. A fabulous placemaking and planning idea. And then I happened to meet a young artist, and we were talking about what it was like to be an artist in Cuba. And it's interesting because I have a friend from Cuba, his name is Mario, and I asked this friend just by chance as we were talking if he knew my friend Mario in Victoria. What are the chances? Well, he did know my friend Mario. And so that's the beauty of traveling, is when it's not just the sites that we see and the places that we visit, it's really the people. And then when we connect with the people, we learn about the politics, the economics, the environmental, the cultural aspects, their personal beliefs, and we start questioning. And that's really important to get to know people, is through questioning. And now I want to talk about racism and decolonizing public spaces. Locally, public spaces here tend to be isolating, not welcoming, and not safe for many folks, especially those from the IPOC, Indigenous, Black, people of color, the LGBTQ2S+, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, two-spirited plus, and diverse ability communities, as these spaces can be dangerous with life or death scenarios, in some cases for these vulnerable communities and vulnerable peoples. George Floyd is a tragic example and reminder of how our streets are not safe, as he uttered his last breath on the pavement with the words, "I can't breathe." Racism is on the rise, with hate crimes and racist comments permeating our public spaces, on our sidewalks, streets, playgrounds, and parks, as well as with white supremacy groups circulating our public spaces. In Vancouver, anti-Asian hate crimes went up 717% in 2020, with the majority of these crimes committed out in the public. And during last year's Wet'suwet'en Protectors Camp at our own Parliament buildings here in Victoria, there was a white supremacy group who were in their cars and walking on the grounds, shouting out racist remarks to the First Nations youth who were camped there. Racism is real, it's raw, and it's ravaging our communities. What is also missing from our public spaces here in the North are inclusive, socially relevant, and culturally significant public spaces where diverse community members see themselves, their values, their cultures, and their visions being represented in the art, architecture, and nature of the public spaces that surrounds them, and where they can feel safe in these spaces. Sadly, I myself do not feel like I belong in the city where I was born here in Victoria, as I do not see any visual representation of my South Asian culture in the built environment, art, or architecture here in the Greater Victoria region. What I do see is that most of urban planning and urbanism is seen through a Eurocentric gaze, which ultimately dictates how our buildings are built, how our public spaces are created, and how our communities are designed. If we want to decolonize our public spaces, then we must first understand that colonization of our landscapes, built and natural, has been in effect since the settlers arrived on the shores of Turtle Island, Canada, and continues today with covert and overt racialized zoning, bylaws, and development in effect that favor one group over another. In fact, the lands that we are now all living upon are unceded and stolen lands from First Nations and First Peoples. And yet there are only sparse whispers and murmurs about land justice, land reconciliation, and land self-determination in the urban planning world. We know that reserves are a classic example of overt racial and exclusionary zoning, where First Nations peoples were forcibly removed from their lands to make room for development of communities and cities for the white settler European population. It is interesting to note that South Africa, during apartheid, adopted the Canadian reserve system and transplanted this racially segregated land use policy onto African soil by creating Black and colored townships, which were communities outside the city core where the white population moved into and lived. Another example are racist land use covenants still circulating today, with some covenants stating that no person of Asian or Black descent are allowed to buy homes in certain areas, such as the Uplands neighborhood and the British Properties neighborhood. Yes, these covenants are considered void, but the language still exists today on paper, on land titles. Last year, a city councillor from West Vancouver, Councillor Marcus Wong, who recently bought a home in British Properties where he was raised, put forth a motion to his council to remove the racist land use language found on the covenant of his land title. And what it said on his land title specifically was, no person of the African or Asiatic race or African or Asiatic descent, except servants of the occupier of the premises in residence, shall reside or be allowed to remain on the premises. Today, racial and exclusionary zoning is also under the disguise of gentrification, pushing out many communities of color so that others can move in and live in expensive condominiums with boutique stores lining the streets at the expense of a myriad of cultures disappearing from these areas. And one of the examples is Hogan's Alley in Vancouver. Back in the 1970s, there was a transportation corridor, the Georgia Viaduct, that was being planned. And in phase one, it was actually built, part of it. And then by doing so, they devastated and cleared the Black community of Hogan's Alley in Vancouver. Today, the Hogan's Alley nonprofit organization is trying to revitalize and rebuild the Black legacy that was thriving in these neighborhoods before gentrification took over. And it's interesting, Jimi Hendrix's grandmother lived in Hogan's Alley and she worked in Hogan's Alley as well. So the questions that I ask as an urban planner are, how can we decolonize urban planning and urbanism? And who is doing the planning of public spaces and who are they planning for? In the near future, I have an article on colonization, which will be published by Primary Colors, a local-based arts initiative. And I want to thank the founders, Franz Trepanier and Chris Creighton Kelly, for this writing opportunity. And the following are some excerpts from this article. So it's a bit of a sneak preview. So in my words, I say, These eyes of whiteness are everywhere in the built environment, and any Indigenous and diverse gazes are often, if any, lost and hidden amongst the colonial mazes, where Eurocentric planning and design continue to colonize many public spaces and spheres. Anishinaabe storyteller Riley Yesno states that our public spaces are not designed for us. There's decolonizing to be done before we can indigenize. Essentially, it is the intersections of placemaking plus art plus culture that can be the catalyst for decolonizing planning and design in cities by actively involving the diverse voices of those on the margins, such as the IPOC communities, and by displaying their cultures and stories and permanent art structures throughout public spaces in our cities. Which now brings me to the concept on the horizon of the planning world called equity-based placemaking. So I myself see the answer not in black and white, but in the gray. Through a decolonizing and equity-based process, we must first remove the colonial gaze and blindfolds when designing and building our cities. And second, we must decenter the colonial approaches to creating our public spaces. Equity-based placemaking is essentially a process and a philosophy that deeply considers and incorporates both the spatial, social, and cultural aspects of public spaces. And I'm excited to say one of my mentors, a new visionary on the placemaking landscape, is an award-winning placemaker. Her name is Jay Pitter, and she spearheads institutional city building projects, specializing in public space design and policy, forgotten densities, mobility equity, gender responsive design, inclusive public engagement, and healing fraught sites. And this is a picture of Jay Pitter on her bike. Jay Pitter is an advocate for the new planning paradigm of equity-based placemaking and states that urban planning has an obsession with imposing European placemaking approaches on diverse North American cities. Through the gaze of Jay, she looks at equity-based placemaking as a process that builds upon pluralism and recognizes power relations within communities and the place-based histories of exclusion and socio-spatial dynamics that shape the character of public spaces. And Jay sets out some tangible steps for equity-based placemaking, which are: acknowledge that urban design is not neutral. It either perpetuates or reduces social inequities. If you haven't been doing equity-based placemaking work prior to the pandemic, kindly refrain from exploiting this moment and allow urbanists with the professional competence and lived experience to lead. Reflect on how your implicit biases, your unconscious thoughts and stereotypes may influence how you view an individual, a group, or an entire neighborhood. Review policies and practices that may be creating invisible barriers for team members from equity-seeking groups to make meaningful contributions within your municipality or firm. Don't conflate an embrace of equity with compromising excellence. Urbanists from equity-seeking groups possess considerable professional expertise and lived experiences. Identify and actively work to reduce power imbalances when engaging communities, especially those with histories of exclusion and/or marginalization. Research the history and untold place-based stories related to all urban design and development projects. And finally, develop equity-based placemaking guidelines, personal learning agenda. So really, equity-based placemaking is when we have diverse hands that can touch and make a difference in the public spaces of their communities. This photo was taken from one of Jay Peters' articles, and I really like it because it shows the different shades of hands, and they're all touching an urban design. So you can have a hand from the Indigenous community, a hand from the South Asian community, a senior's hand, a youth hand, a self-identified female hand, a hand from the LGBTQ2S plus spirited community. a hand from the disability community. It really is all about having a myriad of hands touching and making this difference in the public spaces where we live. Now I want to touch upon some placemaking examples here in the local scene. So we went a bit from the global south with some examples, and now I'd like to take us on the journey coming to the local north. So this mural is entitled Girls Are Fierce Like Tigers, and it's by South Asian artist Sandeep Johal. Sandeep Johal lives and works and creates her art in Vancouver, and I'm proud to say she's actually my cousin. And the first time that I saw this mural was with my friend Claudia, and it was for the Mural Fest. And it's located at 10th and Broadway on one of the side alleys. And when I turned the corner and saw this mural for the first time, I actually got emotional, because it's the very first time in my life that I ever saw a visual representation of myself and my South Asian, in particular Indian culture. You'll notice she has a bindi, and I'm wearing a bindi tonight. She's on a tiger, because in India we have the Bengali tigers, and she's utilizing the motifs from India. She is representing the South Asian culture. She's representing diversity. She's representing gender justice, and she's doing her work for all of us. And I would greatly encourage you to check out this mural and her many murals, because it's different ways of doing, being, and knowing that really transforms a community. The next one is definitely local, and these beautiful art pieces are called Earth Drums by our local Indigenous artist. His name is Kerry Newman, and some of you know Kerry Newman here in the Greater Victoria area. So these beautiful earth drums are located in Saanich and at the Cedar Hill Golf Course. And they're stunning. They're actually interactive drums. So you can walk around them, and with your hands, you can play these art pieces. So he's combining nature, his Indigenous culture, he's combining a public space, he's welcoming it to everyone. Very stunning placemaking right here in our backyard. And another example is a personal project of mine when I was working for Progressive Intercultural Community Services Society about 20 years ago in Vancouver. I was responsible for creating an arts and culture youth project. In the first year, I had to recruit 10 youth on a 6-month project. And I consciously and purposefully went out, and I wanted to have First Nations youth as part of this group. So 9 out of the 10 youth were First Nations. And over 6 months, I taught life skills, professional development, personal development. But the very cool part was that the youth had to come together and create a community mural, because we had federal funding that stated that this mural had to be seen on a transportation corridor. So this mural is located on the Vancouver Flea Market, the big red building at Main and Terminal, and it's visible by car, it's visible by the SkyTrain, and it's a beautiful mural. If you look closely, you'll see at the very top, its wood panel is created by a Gitscan youth, and it's using the Gitscan Indigenous artwork. And then down below, I had hired a graffiti artist, and down below, it says, "Protect the land" in graffiti. The youth called this mural the Monumental Mural. And we were lucky because City Hall of Vancouver supplied all of our paint, and they actually gave us the paint that you put on after you do a mural, the anti-graffiti paint. So no one can tarnish this mural. If they do, they can wipe it off. So I'm really honored to have been part of this process, because I can only hope that the young First Nations youth 20 years later now today, when they see this mural, it brings back that spirit that they were involved in. And it was that spirit of empowerment. And I really want to highlight this one as well. So let's talk about the future now in terms of local placemaking and some ideas that I've come up with for the Greater Victoria region. So if we look at accessibility and motion placemaking, this is what I found from a documentary that we can transplant here. Why don't we place large stable mats at the entrance of our beaches all the way to the water so that barriers to accessing the shoreline and water are removed for those with diverse abilities, providing them with the opportunity to fully enjoy these public spaces. If I look at Gyro Park in Catawba Bay Beach, there's a retaining wall. So if you're in a wheelchair, you can't touch the sand and you cannot touch the water, but there are ways that we can work around that. And this is one great example. For the LGBTQ2S spirited plus place for the LGBTQ2S spirited community. And in terms of Indigenous reconciliation placemaking, we absolutely need to redress the naming of Mount Doug to the Indigenous name of Pecoles as part of the District of Saanach's commitment to Indigenous truth and reconciliation and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And finally, we come to what I like to call spontaneous or carpe diem placemaking. Now, this is in East Vancouver, and it's outside of my friend Kevin's house in East Van. And one summer night, we were at his house doing a cook-up, and traditionally Kevin puts long tables in his backyard, invites about 10 or 15 people for absolutely a wonderful dinner. But this time the streets were blocked for months and months because they were putting in some sewage infrastructure. So the streets were blocked. It's pretty close to commercial. So we knew that the streets were blocked. So the idea came up was, why don't we have our dinner transplanted from Kevin's backyard right into the streetscape in front of his house? So we pulled up the long table, had some linen, some wildflowers, you'll see some wine glasses. And this was the start of our evening. We sat down later on, about 10 or 15 of us. We had our dinner, our wine, and just by chance, there was someone did some graffiti. As you can see, it says East Van on it. So that's why we placed our table there, because it was at the intersection. And before we knew it, within an hour and 2 hours, we had other people bring their tables and bring their chairs. And then we had someone bring a boom box with music. So we ended up dancing. And this is what community spirit is all about through spontaneous and carpe diem placemaking. So yes, we can actually do that here in Victoria, in the Greater Victoria region, in your local park, on your streets with pandemic restrictions, of course. But if you do this, people will come. And when people come, that builds community. So I really wanted to show this picture as an example of spontaneous and carpe diem placemaking. And finally, with some concluding remarks, the fact that community visioning is only as strong as the threads that weave it together. And the threads are you, the people. So I leave you all with a question, which is, what is your vision of creative placemaking and equity-based placemaking in your own community? So shukriya, thank you. Thank you for holding space. And thank you for going on the journey from the global south to the local north with me. And I'm open for questions or comments. Thank you again.
Great.
Great.
Thank you, Jasmindra. Can you stop sharing your screen? Here we go. We're all back. Did you have any thoughts, Luke? Or
Yeah,
should we jump
I
in?
just was so inspired. That was just so lovely, Jasmindra. I mean, it takes us your vision of what a public space can be. You know, a safe space for everybody, an accessible space for everybody, and an inspiring beyond. You know, just I mean, I guess so often our spaces here in Victoria and in Western Canada and Canada have just been nature to get away from it all, right? But then that leads to, you know, trails that are not accessible to people or not safe. Anyways, it's just very inspiring. So I know we've got some questions lined up, so I'll turn it over to Rita to get started on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke.
All right. All right. And thank you for that great presentation. You've certainly given us lots to think about. I'm overwhelmed by how far we need to go in terms of changing what's been done already. That's always what I think about, you know. There's even trying to think about bicycle infrastructure is mind-boggling sometimes, because you're dealing with, you know, millions of dollars and millions of miles of roads that have been built for cars, you know, and how do we undo that, or at least think differently for the future? It's not an easy thing, is it? You know,
But
Yeah.
collectively,
Yeah. Yeah. So the first question that came in from Marg was, please give us some examples of what you are proposing and what we are presently lacking. And I think she's thinking of, you know, locally. How can we be doing things different? What should we be doing here in Victoria?
yeah, I think that's why it was important for me to cite those 3 examples. For accessibility, we have to think about why our public spaces aren't accessible. And so definitely we need ramps. And there's so many ideas that we can take from the global south as well. So we have Market Square, and yes, you know, we utilize our Market Square downtown, but it can be so much more. We can have live music venues, we can have dancing there, we can put lights up around Market Square. That's one example. There's so many different examples. The scene from Havana, Cuba. Do we have an artist center here? Not really, but Granville Island in Vancouver does. And Granville Island is a great example of placemaking. So we can do that in Victoria. We can build an art specific space where we have different food, different artists, different cultural venues. So we can have something similar to Granville Island right here in our backyard. And absolutely, we have to have more Indigenous planning all across the Greater Victoria region to breathe the life that needs to be breathed into our spaces. And by redressing, which the City of Vancouver is a great example, they actually have a planner, and the position is a cultural and redress planner, and they have a Black diaspora and redress planner. And these planners in the City of Vancouver are trying to redress the wrongs that were committed to those equity-seeking groups, such as the Black and African population. So we also need to redress, and that's why Mount Doug is a great example of calling it what it should be called. And then we can look at other examples around the Greater Victoria region by talking with our First Nations peoples and seeing what they would like to envision and what they would like to remain. But I think this is also a great opportunity for people just to kind of plant the seeds in their minds, and then go to their neighborhood associations, go to their community organizations, go to their municipality, and question the planners there, question the politicians. Why are the spaces not being utilized in Victoria? And then do a design charrette in your own community. Set up a cultural cafe in your own community. So to answer that person's question, these are the ways that we can actually start creating more vibrant placemaking here in the Greater Victoria region.
Yeah, and I think one of the, you know, the really negative consequences of COVID is it has derailed our planning. Probably set us back a few years, right? Because all these other issues came forward for city councils and communities to deal with around the homelessness and that, which is such a big issue for people here, you know, that our parks were not accessible to us during that time, and trying to deal with the consequences of that and the energy that it took up. of all of us to deal with that. And now that we're going to start coming back outside again, it's starting to think about those kinds of things. Yeah, well, one question I have, but I'll keep going to these other ones because we have had some other questions come in. People saying thank you. How do you get, Susan wants to know, and I think a lot of us are thinking this, how do you get the public councils to understand and move towards inclusivity?
That's a great question. I had the honor of leading the first phase for the City of New Westminster's first diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism framework. So it starts with our municipalities actually passing a motion to conduct these frameworks. And the City of Victoria here locally is setting up an equity office. So they've hired 3 positions right now looking at equity, inclusion, and diversity. And the City of Victoria has also embarked on an equity, diversity, inclusion framework. But I do want to do a shout out to New Westminster, because the City of New Westminster is one of the very few municipalities that calls it equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism framework. And we should not shy away from using the word racism or anti-racism. So I commend the politicians, the planners, and the city staff at New Westminster for the great work that they're doing. And we're also doing it here too, but we have to say it out loud. The mayor of Winnipeg recently said we should not shy away and talk politely about inclusion. We have to name it out loud. The mayor of Winnipeg said, and he said it's racism. And in Victoria, we have polite racism. And Martin Luther King said this in the 60s. It's polite racism that we're dealing with, which means it's often silent racism. And Victoria is a colonial city. So we have some way to go to uncover and unlayer within ourselves to really have those uncomfortable conversations. And as a facilitator, I feel that we have to make people comfortable in their uncomfortability. And when we can do that with our cities, our municipalities, our politicians, our friends, our community members, we're going to now make the changes that need to be happen, but we can't keep it silent.
Right. So language is very important, and naming what we want, right? And not being afraid to have difficult conversations as well when we need to. So Jim has an interesting point about shopping centers. And shopping centers seem to be public spaces of Victoria and North America in general. And they're full of people and their cars. University Heights, which you probably know near UVic, is slated for redevelopment and apparently is in an advanced stage of design. How would you recommend people try to improve its redevelopment to achieve some of your vision of placemaking? Or is it even possible with a shopping center?
Thanks, Susan. And I live a few blocks away. I was raised in this area of Garden Head. So I've been going since I was a little girl. And I just moved back to Victoria. I was gone for 20 years and just arrived back 6 years ago. And I am coming up with ideas myself because I've seen the new plan, but I feel it's missing in the sense we don't have those spaces. So I envision in the new development, could we have more benches, more tables, more sitting area, so the elderly especially can sit and relax after they've done their grocery shopping. I also envision a small stage with a tent for live music. So someone with a saxophone, someone with a guitar, we can have live music up in the new redevelopment of University Heights. We absolutely should bring in planters of flowers, vegetables. So let's bring in the naturescape as well. We have such a prime opportunity right now in that redevelopment to actually have some interesting and interactive placemaking. And for Susan, maybe one idea, I also sit on the board of the conversations for the One Planet region with Dr. Trevor Hancock. And we're talking about all of this too. We need to bring in diversity and inclusion into our public spaces, but we need to also bring in vibrancy. And so let's make that development vibrant, inclusive, and diverse. But let's come together collectively and do some design charrettes, whether it's through our neighborhood association, and talk more about how we redevelop University Heights.
With COVID and not being able to meet in person, as Patricia is mentioning here. How do we do it when we can't meet in person? Has a lot of that work been stalled, or are people trying to do it online around the world? What is happening?
Yeah, Patricia, it's definitely online. I'm having stimulating conversations around placemaking and planning with other people. And I think maybe the time now is to create a seed bank, a seed of ideas in our seed bank, whether that's individual and then out in community. So when that time comes, we're ready to roll out those seeds and start planting. So now it's a really fruitful time. As you know, we're all planting right now. So let's plant those placemaking seeds. So we're ready. And as Dr. Trevor Hancock says, it's about the great reconnect. We're going to have that great reconnect one day where we are going to see each other on the streets. But let's be prepared and have those ideas.
Right. So it doesn't have to stop. It just takes a different form while we're kind of a waiting period. It feels like kind of like we're seeds underground. We're waiting to sprout at any moment.
You got it.
So Anna McLeod has a comment, and she says she's raising her hands to my beautiful gem mother. I am the Anna that is mentioned in the presentation. It is integral to honor Indigenous ways of knowing, doing, and being in making spaces safe enough for Indigenous, Black, and people of color. Indigenous voices need to be present, especially because we are on their lands. So that's a comment she made.
I want to thank my deaf daughter as well. And she's doing the work right now for all of us as well. She's part of Antidote, which is an Indigenous and multiracialized girls and women network in Victoria, the longest running. We're both co-president. And Anna is a young Indigenous woman that is planting her seeds. So
great. And I'm wondering, Luke, how long we want to go. Maybe till quarter after. If you're still there, Luke.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea because we want to be respectful of our time here. So yeah.
Right. We've got a few questions that I think will round it out well.
Yeah.
So Patricia's asking another bigger question. How can this be applied on a larger scale? For example, as part of the creation of community plans and local plans that are focused on, rather than the focus on overall neighborhoods as opposed to individual spaces.
Yeah, another great question, Patricia. So it's the Cordova Bay local area plan that has just come out. They're doing some really stimulating work, and they've actually reached out to the First Nations peoples, and they've started to build those bridges, first and foremost, of trust and relationship building to address how can Cordova Bay incorporate Indigenous principles around planning. So that's a really good example right now that is happening. And absolutely, with our local area plans, as the public, as community members, we need to put our input into those plans. Otherwise, the fear it might be too top down. And what we want is bottom up approaches, the grassroots participatory democracy part of community building, which is you, Patricia, and others coming together, going to City Hall through a Zoom platform, questioning what are they doing in the different neighborhoods, asking why they don't have diversity, inclusion, accessibility. Putting forth those questions to our politicians is really important, but being actively involved, joining committees, municipal committees is a great way to get one's say and passing a resolution, hopefully. So there's different areas in terms of the wider lens on placemaking and planning.
Okay. Couple of interesting questions here. Jim is wondering about bike lanes and that network of bike paths that surround the city of Victoria, which seems to be successful in the eyes of those who use the protected paths, but also very controversial for others in terms of for the drivers and the costs that were involved with that. What improvements could have been made in that process? So we could look at that, I guess, as an example.
Yes, it is a controversial one. If I can just give a local example, I was going for a walk the other day with my mom right here around their park, Larchwood and Mackenzie, and we have new bike lanes that have gone in, but I don't see them utilized. And so I said to my mom, I wonder if the planners and the engineers, if they actually had done a 3-month study of maybe scouting out and scoping out the area first and putting some kind of radar that can detect the motion of bikes, like to have a quantitative amount, how many bikes are going down Larchwood. So I really feel sometimes what's missing in planning and engineering, and I used to work for a municipality myself, is that it's doing that community needs assessment that sometimes gets missed or doesn't have the duration or the funds in our municipalities, but it's so vital to do a community needs assessment first around whether it's biking, affordable housing, mobility. So I think that's something that we can go towards our politicians and ask them more about why aren't we conducting community needs assessments, and then having those spaces and places for us to meet and talk about what you're talking about.
Okay, and one last question from Claire, and she's got some comments. It's a bit long here. She says, thank you, the presentation. Relationships are a crucial part of building trust. However, it's hard to see where connecting points are with municipal planning that are more relationship based, which is different from community engagement prior to a community plan. Community artists and artists in residence can help to weave community trust, but where are they? I know of Paulina Granger at ICA, who besides being the centralized municipal planning programmer, is paid to help weave the community together.
Mm-hmm. Well, hi, Claire. Claire also sits on the board with me for Conversations for a One Planet region. So we've been having these discussions as well.
Right.
So Claire, I really think it's about promoting creative placemaking, equity-based placemaking, and putting forth those terms, and then also educating our politicians on what creative placemaking could be and how do we build those bridges absolutely here in Saanich with the district of Saanich, because we don't have a centralized person in the sense of what Paulina is doing, and Paulina works for ICA, so it's a community organization. Right. So we can look at our community organizations here in Saanich and see what they're missing, and then can we step in and then create that thread, weave that thread with the district of Saanich. It's going to take more dialogue, it's going to take more education, and it's going to take more promotion of the planning context of calling it creative placemaking.
Well, we're at 8:14, Luke. Do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Rita. You're always so good at conveying the questions and summarizing them and keeping the dialogue interesting. And Jasmindra, thank you. This is just a wonderful way for us to end this section of our series of Voices of Victoria. You know, those of us in the Green Party, we just talk politics all the time, politics, and which is obviously designed to improve community. But, you know, just seeing the things that you're talking about and it just brings such a different and needed perspective to those of us who care about our communities and want to make them better. So thank you. And I also want to say a big thank you to Barbara Hanson and Jim Hesser in the Oakby Gordon Head Riding Association executive, and they have been the ones who have been looking for the speakers and who engaged with Jasmindra and did all the groundwork to get it going to where we are today. So there's a lot of behind the scenes with this, and thank you to them. And then Rita also, we were alternating months with who was doing which one, and so sourcing the speakers that you got and getting all that organized. So the plan is for us to reconvene this in the fall, either perhaps September or October, and so we'll be looking for more interesting speakers and hope to continue to engage you along the way. So everybody, thank you very much. Jasmindra, again, thank you, and Rita, thank you, and thank you all to those who tuned in. And this has been recorded, and we will have a link. We'll be sending a follow-up email to you, and we'll have the link to the recording, and it'll also be in the Oak Bay Gordon Head Facebook page. And Rita, perhaps you might share it on yours as well, your Victoria one. So okay, everybody, thanks again, and good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.